Good afternoon. My name is Christy Durrett.
We'll get through that.
I'm with the alumni engagement team here at the university, and I'm just so thrilled to have so many friends and family and alumni and staff, faculty gathered to welcome Eleanor back to campus. We are thrilled that she accepted our ask to come and talk with us about her story. So this afternoon, I don't want to spend much time. Many of you know Eleanor. She's a Professor Emerita. She was our first endowed chair of the Papuzzi Ethics and Civic Engagement chair, and taught world religions and has had such an impact in our community and has created ripple effect for community and civic engagement, certainly globally. And I think this next hour is just going to be a little snapshot into what you'll find to be an amazing book. And I'm delighted that my colleague and an alumna, Pam Boutselis, has agreed to facilitate a conversation. They actually joked about ignoring all of you and just chatting about the book.
It really wasn't a joke.
Pam is a voracious reader and a fantastic storyteller and does a lot of our content work and storytelling at the university. And so I think this will be a really engaging conversation. When they're done with their part of the program, there will be an opportunity to ask questions or share your own connections to the Dunphy story. And I invite you to continue to get refreshments if you need them. The restrooms are down the hallway. This is being live streamed, so we wanted to invite folks who could not be here to be here with us. And it will be taped, and following our program, we will make that available for folks to be able to have as either a remembrance or to share with others who might not have been able to participate today. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Christy. Welcome, Eleanor.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, in theory, this is for everyone, but it's really my big thrill. I get to have the converation now.
She has connection with Lowell. That's what it comes down to.
Now, I'm excited to be able to talk to you after reading your book, which I enjoyed so much. So, the Dunphy family story. It all starts with your parents, both who are such remarkable individuals. So at first glance, it seems fair to say that no one probably would have met them and thought, this amazing story is going to unfold. And what they managed to accomplish and all of their children and children's children, do you feel like this was a planned effort, or was it just a matter more of a very savvy businessman and talented orchestra leader just taking full advantage of the opportunities through his hard work and just his own talents and that of his family?
Well, first of all, I have to thank my colleagues, really extended family, for being here this afternoon. I'm astounded as I look around the room. We go back to New Hampshire College days, many of us, and to see you blended in with friends from the community, two of our wonderful Democratic leaders from the New Hampshire state family of politicians, one of whom I will mention as having been your dad in the book, Donna Soucy. With all of the others of you who have come this afternoon, I'm more than grateful. When we talk about coming back, it's exactly what I did here. It seems that I haven't graduated yet. I'm still working toward that degree. And I hope maybe this might qualify for a few credits. Because you mentioned something about planning and my parents. And my first thought is they didn't plan anything, especially parenthood. My mother had indicated that she graduated from the Boot Mills in Lowell, Mass. She called it her College of Knowledge when she received an honorary degree from Merrimack College with Arthur Fiedler. And in her own winsome way, this later in her life, he said to her, and what is your background? He heard about the family, and she said, yes, I'm a proud graduate of the College of Knowledge at the Moot Mills, but they did not have a major in Planned Parenthood. In fact, my mother and father met as teenage mill workers, like perhaps some of your grandparents and parents. In those days, there was this wonderful plan as part of the club that you belonged to as a mill worker, my mother being 13 when she started, my dad being younger. But once they got into the older teens, they would put a quarter a week away from September until May. And with that total, from her group, which was the Violet Club girls, they would rent a house at Salisbury Beach for 1 week, take the trolley, and head to the beach. It was something they looked forward to. My dad belonged to the Chickasaws, and the Chickasaws did the same thing. And luckily, in 1913, the two groups had houses next to each other. And that was the way that Kate Manning met Roy Dunphy, an orchestra leader who had a job, again, at the mill. But as they got to know each other, I think he really knew what he wanted, because by September, Labor Day, as a matter of fact, he was asking her to marry him. My mother said yes, but she was hesitant because she already had an engagement ring hidden in her lunch pail at the factory, because a wonderful young man had already asked her to marry him. And knowing what had just flared up in the summertime and how much she wanted to choose this drummer boy, she put off the engagement for a year till she could figure out how to graciously, if there was a way, return it. Well, there was no gracious way, because he was at the door a few days later asking if the rumor mill, I guess that rumor mill, was accurate, and sure enough, he wanted the ring back. Case solved. Later, when we'd plead with her to write her book, she would say, "I don't need a book to write my life, Eleanor. I could write it in one sentence. I was engaged to your father on Labor Day, and I was in labor ever after." So out of your question of planning, and out of their youthful love and happiness, being mill workers, and then my father getting a good job, they were ready to set off like so many others. Getting married in St. Patrick's Rectory in Lowell. They couldn't afford a church wedding, so they and 24 other couples gathered in the rectory, got the blessing, off to Lowell Depot, into Boston for their honeymoon. And the kind of life then that they came back to was one that my mother, whom I mention here, was able to detect the entrepreneurial potential that my dad had. He had this orchestra, and he was getting gigs, every night of the week and pulling in a good crowd. He had a new job at John Hancock Insurance. And so when the first couple of babies came along, she was feeling quite secure. But as I quote her, we did get her to write her memoirs, which we titled Not Cheaper by the Dozen. I excerpted some of those, but this one will give you, I hope, a response to your question. Roy was now entertaining the idea of going into business for himself. His work with John Hancock Insurance and his orchestra engagements were bringing in a salary to keep us comfortable. I was pregnant, of course, every 2 years between the ages of 22 and 44 years, she could say that. I was pregnant with my third child and not too anxious to see Roy make this move. I didn't interfere though, because I saw him keep up his orchestra, thriving and organized as he was. I sensed he could and wanted to be his own boss. And so it was in this way that they turned to what was to become the roots of the entire trajectory of the family. Because the place that Roy wanted to buy was a luncheonette around the corner from the apartment building in the acre section of Lowell. And that purchase, as my mother said, over that counter, all 12 children learned about the world from their dad. In making this change, she indicated also, little did we know that that decision would make such a difference. And I guess that is a discovery of my parents that I appreciated even more now, because they never got stuck. They felt some kind of ability to take a risk when it was called for. And when you think of the 12 different children, very different in personality, that they bore, and their ability to adjust and adapt to the 12 different lives, very different lives, it's because, I believe, of their ability to hold on to some deep values, but then be able to adapt. So let me stop there and let you pick up.
Well, you see, you know, your mom plays such a vital role too. And I love that you've interspersed part of her book throughout your own, because it just gives you such a sense of who she is. And I know you and I had talked about, you know, she had so much heart and such grace and was so adaptable. And she had such good humor, but she made everyone feel like family. And I know you've spoken too about being on the road for your book and just meeting people that she made feel so special. How did she do that?
I wish I knew completely. There was a way. Fortunately, she was given many gifts just in her own person. But I think anyone has to develop those and tap them. And I believe that one of the things that she was able to do with that adaptability was be resilient. Because, as you know, having 3 babies at the doorstep of the Great Depression, she had a baby 1928, 29, and 30. So having the war on the doorstep next, that not just my mother, women in those days and always had the double role of trying to keep up, especially the family. And for some reason, I'm sure it's the love they had for each other, plus this ability to turn to the task at hand, also not taking themselves too seriously, but rather very quick to joke. Trying to get my 9-year-old brother, Jack, who became the CEO of Omni Hotels, out from under the bed after the police came to the door looking for, they knew, a Dunphy who had gotten into trouble in the neighborhood. My mother laughed later, telling the story of how she grabbed a broom, because of course the bedroom was so tiny, there was just the bed. And Jack had ensconced himself in the far corner because he knew when he heard the patrol car that he was going to be in big trouble. And he says, he had pushed the envelope too far. And when he saw my mother down on the floor with the broom, that he felt that it was quits. Until he said, she laughed. And she picked up and she said, he's right. I looked at the situation and I thought, what would anybody think if they saw me on the floor with a broom with Jack in a corner and the two of them, and he said he got punished, but the two of them laughed. And I say that as an example that Jack brought up to me many years later, talking about her personality and her ability to distinguish about the battle you fight and the battle you don't. And she knew when to laugh and lower the boom, or the broom. And
yes.
She did. But I think it's those traits that are many in the book, and that you get to know her as the ordinary person she is, but with that gift of discernment that not everything is going to be a big battle.
So true. What I found so unique, and I'm sure others do as well, is as your family business unfolded and it continued to expand, it wasn't a case your parents were having a business, it was everybody was part of this business. And I know you and I had chatted a little bit that, your father was so good at seeing the talents and the potential and really making someone almost the specialist in the family for something. And for me, it seemed as though, he was an orchestra leader, so he already knew what he needed to make this whole picture. And it's like all of you were part of that orchestra, and he was able to identify what he needed to make that sound perfect. And what seemed to be really amazing too was that everyone had something to offer, so you all really kind of bought in and wanted to be a part of it. And you described something that stuck with me. You used the image of the 4 fingers and the thumb to make a fist that works tight together, with many other fingers as well, and toes, I believe you said.
Yeah, I ran out of digits when I was talking about the
Tell us about that, though.
Well, my dad spent enough time with us, literally from the time we were born, because the first 9 were born at home. And he was there with my grandmother and aunt, the usual suspects, except for a birth that they weren't available for. And he had to say, Kate, you better get into bed. And sure enough, Michael Dunphy, my nephew here, your dad was born. And she said, almost on the kitchen floor. So after 9 births, being present, 10, 11, and 12 were born in a hospital. And of course, fathers couldn't go into the delivery room. I said, he knows more about this stuff than the obstetrician does.
Yeah.
He's been doing this. He's an old hand at birthing. And it wasn't just birthing. It was following up. He spent so much, we all walked to the store with him to open up at 5:30. So all of us in turn were there. And I don't know whether it was talents we had or jobs that needed to be done, so you develop the talent. I don't ever remember learning to waitress. I just knew. It was at 13, my brother and I ran our our restaurant at Hampton Beach. He was the manager. He was 17, and I was 13. There were 75 employees. He was hiring them all, mostly lovely-looking girls from UNH and the rest, putting his 13-year-old adolescent sister to shame, but I could train them to waitress. So in that case, it was something that had to be done, and we did it. But for the other traits, he really did assess. That same Jack that I left under the bed with you a moment ago, that same Jack told me that when he was 16 and got his license, my dad said, now you're going to have to be the driver. And sure enough, the first day that a whole group in the car, including my father, drove, Jack said that somebody pulled out and he had to make a decision whether or not to go up on a sidewalk where he could see that he would avoid, or, possibly hit a pole. And Jack said that later my dad said to him, "You made the right decision, and that's the way you're going to have to make decisions." And I think maybe it was those, again, informal ways that the personalities of my brothers did evolve to meet the needs of the growing business.
And your family operated too as such a true democratic unit. And
Democrats maybe in politics, maybe.
But it seemed though, everybody kind of had a say and had
You're right. Yeah.
Kind of state their case and why they deserve certain things, what they could bring to the table. And it seemed so well respected too. And I'm sure it was very colorful at times.
And I think what Pam is raising, yes, it is true that as the business evolved, and we can say something about that as well. I might insert here that in the end, I decided to do 2 appendices to this story because there was so much about the business just in and of itself. So I did a chronology from clams to corporations. And that's Appendix 1. And in that, you'll see the trajectory from this little luncheonette counterculture at the beginning of the book to Omni Hotels in which we sold in 1988. So we went from about 1948 to 88. But as that progressed, and I think I lost the train of thought in the specific, there was one specific part that you just mentioned.
The way, people stated their case and said, I should be in this position, this should be my salary, and that was great.
That is the way the 5 brothers that originally were in the business planned at weekly meetings in one of the living rooms in Hampton, New Hampshire. By this time we had migrated to Hampton, New Hampshire. We had a few clam stands at Hampton Beach and a couple of others. We had a restaurant in Durham, New Hampshire, because after the brothers came home from World War II, they had the benefit of the GI Bill. And when they arrived, they bought a pharmacy and turned it into a restaurant over Christmas break, borrowing the equipment from the beach, which they would then return in May to the beach. Opened when the students came back. They also built Town and Campus, which any of you UNH people here will know still is active, kind of the first Staples. We could have been maybe the first Staples if we didn't stick to clams. So in those steps, each of the personalities and each of the business decisions had to be made, and they had to be unanimous. They also had to make a case for their yearly salary. And there was a long meeting every year, especially because the 6th brother, Richard, Dick, was studying to be a lawyer. He would then go on to become Chief Justice of New Hampshire Superior Court. Dick could wax eloquent over any subject, especially when it had to do, when he was going to be working with his brothers, making a case for his pay. And my brother Jerry would say, we knew we were in for a long night when it was Dick's turn to make his case for what he deserved. But that did play out very importantly and seriously in the years where the politics began to become involved in more formally. My brother Bud had a definite gift in the political realm, again from my dad, whom he talked about watching very closely in the way he served customers, the way he took an unpaid job at City Hall for welfare when the welfare commissioner went to jail for graft, and how he saw in the acre in Lowell over the counter the needs of the people having no route to City Hall. So having watched my dad's actions, not his words, Bud and all of us really had that little political inoculation along with the pot roast on a Sunday. There was a lot of politics in the family. But Bud seemed to have a real gift at the time. And it was my brothers, 5 of them, had to decide that they would release Bud from his work to work in the Democratic National Committee. And that meant that the others had to make up for the job he wasn't doing. And of course they'd make a big thing of this and let him know very often. But that really was, I think, one of the keys. The other one was that because it was so different, every person in the family, if you were to start a business and you had a certain personality, the best way for success is to go look for those traits that you don't have in someone else and somebody you can trust. We were really fortunate, and there were so many of us, you had a lot of those traits built in, and you could fight, and you could disagree and argue, but at the end of the day, you trusted. It was a very important lesson for us to learn that we needed to get advice from people you could trust. In one case, when we bought the pharmacy and turned it into a restaurant in Durham, we inherited the most wonderful manager, a tried and true citizen of Durham. And he kind of came along with the counter in the pharmacy. And my parents were so grateful that my brothers had like a father away from home, someone to overlook. And my brother Jack just did not feel good about this man after a while. And sure enough, they got suspicious that I think he was helping himself to more than a cup of coffee in the morning. So this particular year, when they were sure that they needed evidence, and they were supposed to go to the restaurant show in Boston, annual restaurant show, they told this employee, Dennis, we're headed out, we're counting on you to cover the territory for the 3 days. But they had, before leaving, built a cubicle in the front window that faced with a peephole into the restaurant where the register was.
I love this story.
Those pharmacies, you know, that have, all right? It was like a vertical coffin, you might say, with a hole, and with plenty of roommates in the basement at that time, 4-legged ones. Unfortunately for my brother Walter, he fit in the structure. So he was voted to stay behind for the 3 days, stay in and write down everything he saw happening at the register. And sure enough, Jack, by the way, said he was miserable. But they were very happy because sure enough, Dennis, for every $1, was pocketing, it was probably every quarter, he was pocketing 10 cents, 15 cents, and had over the year or two in his employ, had taken probably, I didn't ever get the total, but probably a good number, a good amount of money that was needed, of course, for the profit in that restaurant. we did not bring him to court because, and again, Jack said this reminded him of how my mother dealt with problems. This is a man that was very loved in town. And here a gang of Irish Catholic Democrats from Lowell, Massachusetts. Who are the citizens in town going to believe if they now say that Dennis has been helping himself to the profits? They called the sheriff whom they knew from Dover, invited him to come over, told him the story, had Dennis come and faced him with the evidence, and after a lot of wrangling, he admitted, and off he went without charges, but left town, left his apartment, and we got his furniture. And I was 13, and it was a stereo among them, and I always loved the fact that they found him out. But the more important thing was that they had to find the right people to trust beyond the cocoon of the family.
You've spoken quite a bit about your brothers and your parents. What about you and your three sisters? You all entered the convent, which many, as we've spoken about, would have thought it was a very sheltered environment, but yet it didn't close you off from opportunity at all. In fact, it gave you so many opportunities. But what was it that led you to the convent? Because given, for instance, even your mother's background, that none of you chose to go a more traditional route.
I always wanted to get married and have 12 children growing up, that was it. And many people have said to me, did you just follow your sisters? Like how come? One of our longtime employees who started peeling French fries at our fried clam stand and ended up 45 years later as executive vice president of Omni Hotels. He had one job. And he would say, I just couldn't figure it out. I think my nephew over here used to say this, why is she going in the convent? And I don't know that I consciously thought of this. What I did know was that I wasn't just following my sisters, because my record was rebellious, and I would be more inclined to do just the opposite of what might be expected. In those days, it wasn't a huge shock, though, for a Catholic girl to go into the convent. When I realized, though, why I did, when I began to wonder about it, I had my three oldest sisters, so I'm with the 8 brothers and the 3. And I look at my prospects when I'm in college, and I think, you know, secretary, nurse, whatever, traditional, get married, have a family. And I looked at my sisters. Now, they belong to an order, Sisters of Notre Dame of Namur, Belgium. They staff Emmanuel College in Boston and Trinity in Washington. And you look at that, and I see one of my sisters, a missionary in Japan, teaching at Todai University, which is the Imperial University of Japan. Another one in Honolulu, another one a reading specialist. 4,000 nuns across the world, because our order was international. And these women are running hospitals, educational systems, wonderful missions. It was, if you're going to save the world and you're 18 or 19 and you live in Lowell, that seemed a very logical thing to do, especially because I had such role models in my sisters. So going in, but then I was the one that made the decision first to leave. But that was after 13 years and 13 amazing years, which I speak about, through the 60s. So not only was there a cultural upheaval in the convent, but the 60s served up a counterculture jolting the venerable traditions of most religious, educational, social, and business institutions that had held too fast to paternalistic rules, rituals, and behaviors far beyond their original intent and usefulness. And I feel very strongly that this book, beyond being about our family, it's really a story about an era that we could look back on and learn so much from, because it is a case where people got stuck, and those institutions were so stuck, and they made what would be rituals the ends, so that the most important thing to do was whatever ritual that business or educational institution was believed to honor. Business was no exception. It was also an era for businesses to wake up to personal and social responsibility, to step up to the plate and become more civically engaged. There was more than a nudge to expand one's business philosophy and entrepreneurial spirit. It was in that decade that we women in our family and our brothers were doing the same kinds of culture shifting in business and in religion. And it is I think that in itself a kind of a plea for us all not to get stuck. And we can do it today, as we tried to get through it in the 60s, and we have the similar challenges right now.
Well, it seems like what was happening in the business world, politics, and within the convent as well, everything was kind of swirling to one place where your family really came together in even greater ways. And I think about, service is such an integral part of the Dunphy family. It's manifested itself in so many ways, from serving people in the businesses, serving people, serving religion, serving, education, social responsibility, politics. Where did that all come from? And can you tell us how that did manifest itself, not only locally and regionally, but also nationally and globally?
I guess the first thing I'd say is, when I did the cover, A Dozen Dunphys to Serve You, we had little brochures with all these doggerel verses about each of us and what we could do, to serve you in the restaurants. And then I realized, well, it did go from the counter into the convent and service and educational ways, and then on to the Parker House, which was the epitome of the hospitality, you might say, trajectory, because what the Parker House represented, especially in the 60s, was a bankrupt hotel in a city torn after assassinations, after busing, in the middle of busing, and the civil rights trauma, and the Vietnam War, all in that. And at that time, I was in the convent, and I was Dean of Women at Emmanuel College up the street. So that, for us especially, was a convergence. I would be meeting with my brother Jerry, who had just moved into the Parker House after our purchase of it, and I was in my world, but the worlds, as you say, were so similar in terms of their challenges. What happened to the Dunphys in the Parker House, and it's, of course, developed in the book, but the Parker House was the grande dame of the hotel world. Mark Twain lived there for a good while he was in Boston. And a reporter asked him one day, what do you think about this hotel? And he said, it's heaven, not by spiritual standards, but by hotel standards. So it was always that jewel, but it was a pretty faded, bankrupt jewel when the Dunphy Gang came down from Maine and in from New Hampshire and decided to buy it. The bankers in Boston pulled out 2 nights before. And we were left with the prospect that it really wouldn't happen. And this was November 1968. The story about that 24 hours is in the book. The upshot of it was that the brother who was the most tenacious and known for it was put on the case, and he decided he would call the bankers up in Casco Bay because we had a hotel in Portland, and we had very good relationships with the bankers and purveyors there. He actually reached them after he was told not even the tellers would be answering the phone that Friday night, 5 o'clock, and he determined that he was going to get through. On the first ring, the president of the board of that bank answered the phone. He happened to be calling a meeting of the board, and my brother Bob told him the story. He said, "I'll go into the meeting," and my brothers Bob and Jack sat by the phone looking at it for an hour. Jack skeptical till the end, Bob sure that it was going to come through. Called, the ring came at 6:30, and the response was, "We're going to send Finnegan down in a plane with the money," and the purchase went through. And the purveyors who hadn't been paid, the waiters who had been working for 3 weeks before Christmas without pay, all over the next 3 weeks the purveyors received 50% on the dollar they agreed to, and the waiters were all paid before Christmas. So with the promise that we would never lose that classic spirit of the hotel, the new era began. And out of that kind of service, which brought us to the Parker House really, because it was only through these relationships that people in the end would trust us, came what is now known as Global Citizen Circle. It started as a response to the Vietnam War, to the assassinations, and to the civil rights horrors, because we found the archives in the Parker House that described these Saturday Club meetings 150 years before with Emerson and Longfellow and Lowell and Whittier. And these men would come together to talk on a Saturday evening, invited by the chefs, because the chefs were trying to do a marketing ploy to get more people to come to dinner at the Parker House. So these, of course, these great literary men would be the ones that would bring attention to their evening discussions. The last one of the recorded sessions was 1902, and Booker T. Washington was at it. So they didn't just talk literature, they talked about critical issues. So 150 years later, we decided we would have dinners where people would come to the tables at the Parker House. The difference being diversity. So that if you invited the president of a college or the CEO of a business or the mayor to dinner at the Parker House, they'd probably come. But they would be surprised to find that when they were seated at table, they might be next to the executive director of the Nashua Soup Kitchen, or a gas station owner from Dorchester, or people that they would not ordinarily be having dinner anywhere with. So that those dinners were an effort, a couple of things. For us, as Democrats, progressive Democrats, to widen our side, to get out of our silo too. Because we had, believe it or not, on one platform, John Sununu with Barney Frank. And we had Warren Rudman, we had Bill Cohen from Maine, we had Kennedy with the SALT treaty and the talks. So that what we tried to do was bring these speakers only to share what they knew and then open it up to people for them to give the kind of insights and questions that they could learn from. That may be what we should be doing now with my talking for so long here.
No, not at all. It's such an intriguing story. And tell us some of the things that the Global Citizen Circle has accomplished, as well as your family, in terms of really changing things in the world.
Obviously, when you have a hotel, you can do those kinds of things. And those dinners never set out to be a nonprofit organization. They set out to address in some way, to do something. And we felt that bringing together people of different opinions could then trigger and develop trust and move towards some common ground so that you could take action in your communities. And by doing that, after year, we would then look back and be told by some of our African American friends from Roxbury, in 1968, the Parker House doors were the only doors in this city that were open to Roxbury and open to the candidates that were running for office. So that then made us say, well, we need to formalize this. And that's really, it was originally New England Circle, till we went to South Africa. And in South Africa, the journalists weren't too much in favor of anything with England in it. So they really gave us our international name. Over the years, because there were so many of us, we could each take a continent or an issue and bring it to the table. And then, just like for the pay, they'd have to argue that that issue was the one that we should be addressing. That trajectory is covered in Appendix 2 of the book about this effort. Fortunately, the university that used to be New Hampshire College in my home here in, and my husband Jim's home, has given us the opportunity over the years to do many of the global citizen related programs as part of my job. And that has been, I think, the lifeblood of the organizations going forward. When I retired formally, I did the archives with Chris Cooper here, your archivist at the library. And after that, President LeBlanc and Patty Lynott invited Global Citizen Circle back to campus with an executive director, Theo Spanos Dunphy. And even though she has the Dunphy, she came so well prepared to pick up on this Dunphy tradition with her degrees from Brown and Tufts School of Diplomacy, and being the main executive director of the World Affairs Council, and now in her second year here. So what has happened is it's just kept growing in unexpected ways, and we hope that that can be the legacy of our parents, starting around the table, over the counter, as we went in and out of the convents and boardrooms, and around the world, that we're still around the table. Because at the end of the day, it's back to the neighborhood. And unless we can be with people of different beliefs, but also simply different opinions, and be open to them as we had to be when we were trying to forge a unified business. Then I think that it will be a great challenge to have any common ground.
Oh, I so agree. So tell us how you ended up at Southern New Hampshire University, then New Hampshire College.
I came in through the kitchen door. I really did. I had moved here. Jim and I had 2 children living in Rhode Island, and Jim was with the Dunphy Hotels and then with First New Hampshire Bank here in Manchester. And I was busy with various things, but I wanted to get back in the classroom. I'm a high school teacher, and I had wanted to get back doing what I love to do. But I heard of New Hampshire College, 10 minutes from my home, which had a very entrepreneurial spirit. And so I kept it in mind. I actually had a yard sale in a cold November day. And at the very end, when I was ready to put down the garage door, a car pulled up, and out of it came what you'd know first impression was the typical university professor. And he came up the driveway and wanted to know if I had any Legos. He was a collector. We got through that, and I saw him, and I said, by the way, I'm interested in New Hampshire College. He said, oh, how did you know that I was at New Hampshire College? I said, well, you have hello. My name is Dawn, and this was New Hampshire College. And he laughed. He had just come from one of the Saturday open houses. And he said, well, yeah, give me your CV. Ran upstairs, gave it to him. Next week, I got a call, and I started. But about 6 months later, I got a call from Don Seeker, my colleague, and he said, Eleanor, I have to let you know, your resume, your CV is not up to date. And I said, well, I don't give out new CVs at yard sales. I said, you got the used one. And actually, I came in the door as an English writing professor instructor in the culinary hospitality division, because of course they saw hospitality. And I stayed for these years, as many of you have, because of the great entrepreneurial spirit in the college and colleagues who loved to teach and wanted to teach and wanted to relate to their students. I look around this room and I see many of you. I see Doug Blaze and Pam Cohen, and I see Jolan. So many that I actually spent years with. People like Kathy, who spend it behind the scenes tutoring students. This is the place that students really were the center of attention. And that is the way I came into New Hampshire College.
So what compelled you now to share your family story?
My age. I figured I'm the last one, and when you turn 80, you begin to wonder what you're leaving, and I knew I had, if nothing else, a story for my family. So I tried for a long time, but finally decided I would hang in and do it. And to put the story between the covers of a book was scary, and still is, but overarching purpose is that we've been very fortunate as a family. Anyone who reads this book will know it. And when you've been given so much, as my mother would say, you know, so much has to be given back. You really have to give back. Not as an obligation, but I will say that the most gratifying part of being number 12. I should say number 11 and 12, my brother Jerry and I have always said we stand on the shoulders of our siblings and parents, each of whom, gave us so much. As Jerry says in the book, if I were an only child, I would not have had the opportunities that I have having so many other siblings. So he calls it the Dunphy credit system. He said, if somebody says, oh, hello and how are you, it isn't necessarily because of anything we've done individually, but rather that as a group, we have benefited from the gifts of 11 siblings and 2 great parents.
And we have benefited from you speaking with us today.
Thank you.
And I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And I know, Christy, you'll be asking some questions, I believe? Or I should say be taking questions, though I'm sure you have many of your own.
I'm so sorry if this beautiful sunny day is right.
I will never complain
I'm thinking
about
it's
that.
nice. I'm feeling like I'm tanning. I'm getting energy.
Any comments or stories to share?
I think I've covered the territory.
You did a great job.
Michael?
Throughout the process of writing the book, was anything more difficult than you expected?
Everything. And I say that in jest, but I say it seriously. When you think of the 100 years and you think of the family, just the 12 of us, not wanting to miss any one of the siblings. That was my, this looks like a small school class, right? And just think of yourself as a teacher. And at the end of the year, you don't want to sell anyone short. You want to really be sure that you have tapped the potential of everyone. And I sat here for years, knowing the family. And as number 12, I had a lens that nobody else had on this family. And it made me less inclined to write because I felt I couldn't do justice to my parents and 11 siblings. So I think the most gratifying part is that as I got to know each sibling again, as well as my parents, I did not have any trouble giving each his or her due. And if that were the only thing I have in the book, that would be enough. Thank you for asking that.
I think you gave everyone their due.
My 95-year-old brother Jack I had him go right to the, in 1985, that's 30 years ago, he had written a memo. They were great for memos, great for communicating all the time. A memo, Jack to Bud, ask Eleanor to write the book about Mother. And so when I gave it to him at Christmas, I said, 30 years, not bad, but I did it. And he went right to his part and he said, whoa, well, I like that. So I passed that test. Dave?
Eleanor, thank you very much for writing the book and for this. But I had a question because you said something toward the end that was interesting. You said back to the neighborhood. And in large measure, your story is local, tribal, global. And there seems to be a lot of tensions in that dynamic these days. How do you keep a balance?
I think life is a compromise. When you say balance, because I look at compromise, here's my take, as with calm, the meaning with promise. I look at it as a good word, just as I look at politics as a good word. And I think life, not just what we're doing in the neighborhood, but life itself, we're always compromising. And we should be, I think, because it's an opportunity for us to take one opinion and another and then forge a common ground, whether we want to go to a concert or the beach, on these forgettable things that we're always compromising on. Our daily life is built on it. And I don't look at compromise as concession, giving in. It's rather that I see what you've got something good in that opinion of yours, and I try to extract it. So when you ask about balancing, I look at that, I look at being unstuck. You'll notice that I use an epigraph in this book, a hero of mine. Dag Hammarskjöld was the second United Nations Secretary. If you don't know of Dag Hammarskjöld, look him up, because you will be inspired. He died in a plane crash, much too young, and was highly respected. But I've loved, and you'll see it in several places in the book, and it is the epigraph: for all that has been, thanks. For all that will be, yes. And I believe, whether we're in the neighborhood or in some other group, that we should look at being grateful for whatever we bring to that, but then not get stuck in it and think that that's the end. But rather, his second part, for all that will be, yes. And that I see in our own family. I saw it here at the university with so many colleagues that I worked with. Not getting stuck, but being able to go beyond the horizon. So I think that's going to be the way, Dave, with our neighborhoods. And I don't think our neighborhoods are going to be geographic. They shouldn't be. They should be bookstores and libraries and churches, if they can embrace and be inclusive. Any place that can be. Because I think geographic neighborhoods tend to be stratified. And our effort has to be to go find, just as we had to in Boston, we had to go find those people we invited to dinner. And then we would find a friend of somebody who came. It has to be intentional. We really cannot think we're diverse by just saying it. It's one of the I believe the hardest part of anything is the beginning. Getting at the door, inviting the people and welcoming them. When you read the story of Coretta Scott King and her children who ended up at my brother's cottage at the lake 2 months after Martin Luther King was assassinated, that invitation comprised a dog named Dinky, a canoe named Putt Putt, a little boat named Putt Putt, and a bunch of Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish kids. That invitation made a kind of a balance, but there had to be the invitation. So that and the compromise in terms of working out issues.
I don't know if I need that.
Please introduce yourself.
Sure.
Please introduce yourself so that some people will know you.
I'm Ray Buckley, the current state party chair here in New Hampshire. And when I saw that you had written the book, I got so excited, and Kathy Sullivan and Judy Reardon both apologized. They were going to be here tonight as well. And why I let Donna know about it was for so many of us, the Dunphy family were larger than life heroes that were real life, whether it was the success they made in business, but also the impact in politics. And I trying to always connect to this generation who are involved in politics in New Hampshire to see where we have come from and who brought us there. That's why we have all the pictures of the family and everybody else, the state party. I was really fortunate last year to stumble upon some oral history interviews of Bud that the Kennedy Library have that talked about his time as state party chair and the writing effort for McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy's campaign, and so much of the stuff, and then some other oral histories of other people talking about Bud in the Kennedy campaigns. And what made it all so come to life, because I only knew Bud as you know, more of a grandfatherly person, and who was always encouraging to every young person I ever knew about. What would they think about where New Hampshire is today with the progress that we've made? And it makes me proud that we've taken all of their hard work, or your family's hard work, and then the impact that one family has made on a state, and it just happens because you did a clam shack in Hampton, and how it has profoundly impacted where New Hampshire is today.
Well, thank you very much, Ray. You know, to answer that question, I look to your right. Here we have the president of the New Hampshire Senate sitting here, a woman. My brothers would have been so happy. When we go back and look at all of their work, women in business and women in politics, talk to any woman of a certain era and she will say that she spent a lot of time on the phone with Walter and Bud, two brothers in New Hampshire, about running for office. It was always a priority. So that number one, that quality, and they were doing it in business, so they felt that it should happen in the party. The party has come so far. I am so excited about the young Democrats right now. Because when you look back to the convention center at the Wayfarer at election time, and we were Democrats year after year, loss after loss, and the peak came the year that Joe Keefe lost for the second time, and he lost to younger John Sununu. And for 4 days before it, William Loeb was not a popular figure in our family, and the feeling was mutual. We were not William Loeb's favorite people in the state. And he had written four days of editorials against Joe. And Joe was, we saw, going down. And a friend next to me with her two high schoolers and I with my middle schoolers are standing there, everybody in the room crying, and she turned to me and she said, "Eleanor, do you realize our kids have never been to a victory party?" So that's the way I answer your question. The Democratic Party, especially today, so heartening. And I think that should be heartening to all of us, because we've been in an era where it is, what is it, the unbearable heaviness of hopelessness. As long as we feel hopeless, we're not going to act. And if there's one thing I think that comes through here is that there is reason. I'll finish by saying my mother used to say, how often do we say? My mother used to say, every generation thinks it has the worst crisis ever, and that's going to be it. And she said, you know, what's interesting is that it seems every new generation develops the skills and the talent and the ability to deal with that crisis. So folks, that's what we're about at a university, helping all of us intergenerationally to build the skills to deal with the crises And we were very fortunate to be in New Hampshire and have the benefit of your father, who helped my brother start the Democratic Party with the Young Democrat Club at UNH. And they were responsible for the first Democratic governor in the state of New Hampshire, John King. Not that we wanted just Democrats, although we wouldn't mind, but there was not a two-party system, and that is what you have thriving today.
Well, at this point, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming along for the journey today. Pam, thank you so much for really guiding the conversation. And Eleanor, I think I could just sit here for a couple more hours and just have you tell us more stories.
No way. Class is dismissed. You have put in your time. I was going to ask at the beginning if anybody saw New Hampshire Chronicle last night.
Yes.
I was going to dismiss you and say, you've done it, 10 minutes. I said, why did it take me 300 pages? When Audrey Cox was able, Audrey Cox, by the way, the producer of that program, I didn't know this, but she wrote to me, she said, I had to do this. She said, I'm from Lowell. I worked at LeMay's, which all through college, and there was a third thing that Audrey was involved in that was just amazing. Oh, and I knew Walter and Kay. I knew two of your siblings. So that 10 minutes, she managed to do what I've had you sitting here in the sun listening to for an hour or more.
I think the story, though, that you bring us back to so many things about what makes us New Hampshire, and I say us as New Hampshire, and I'm a transplant, having married someone born and raised in Manchester. His mother was born in Lowell, and father lived in the mill yards in Manchester. And I just find all of this intersection so important to hear and listen to. And so I know there are many folks who want to come through, share a hello, have their book signed. And so I think we'll move to that portion. Oh, you have one thing? Yeah, sure. I'm so sorry.
Jolan. Jolan.
My question is that Rose, myself, and some other folks here are the new New Englanders. Okay.
That's right.
What do you think would be like an advice you can give us old New England, you old New Englanders, to new New Englanders, to be able to not only survive the winters of the region, but to actually flourish in this really wonderful part of the country? My folks are in Texas, but I opted to, by choice, be in this snowy place. What do you think would be a good advice for myself and new Americans and how to flourish in this part of the country?
Jolan, first of all, I am just so happy to see you. Jolan and Rose, Rose just received a leadership award, 30 years of leadership here at the university. And Jolan, who worked with me with community-based research and has done the same all over the world. How do I give you advice? I can say it very simply. The old cannot survive and should not survive in a cocoon. And welcoming the new, whether it be students from many countries around the world into our own homes, and you'll read how Jim and I had such a privilege of having African refugees and El Salvadoran refugees live with us in our home, all because of New Hampshire College, Southern New Hampshire University. And it's the simple things. It's just the invitation and the putt-putt, and the Inky the dog. Ours was Blarney. And the kind of home felt inclusion that we can share a meal and our life with the kinds of people who have come from so many amazing places and done so many amazing things and suffered so much. I remember when the South African refugees lived with us, the family. My seventh grade son was riding to school with Jim, and the radio was announcing the 10th anniversary of the Soweto uprisings. Now, these people were from Soweto. And he said to my husband, gee, you know, Soweto was such a faraway place before CD came to live with us. And now it seems like it's next door. That refugee who had given birth to a baby, who they had no country, no home. We learned so much. Same with El Salvador. And this university has always had an opportunity and continues to try to take advantage. But it has to be by invitation. It won't just happen. Those round tables in the dining hall will get blended when people send out invitations to come to them or to the home. So that's really it, Jolan. It comes down to what you have lived your whole life too. The Philippines is well represented here with the two of you.
You know, it dawns on me you're speaking like a true hospitality professional. You're making the invitation and you're welcoming everyone to the table.
When you're one of 12, especially the 12th, everything is hospitality. Everything is a restaurant, even dinner at night when you have that. So yes, I hope.
I see your next book.
Oh,
Everything is hospitality.
The next generation. The next generation. Thank you very much.
It's like we got to have a day at the beach together. It's like a day at the beach together.